It was the Christmas night of 1824 in the old garrison city of Halifax. An old man stumbled through the dark, cold, and icy streets. Drunk and lonely, he had come into the city from his little hometown so that he would not be alone that Christmas day. He was lost. He was looking for a public house where he could rent a room for the night. By dawn, he would be dead. He would be casually murdered in cold blood by a handsome, young, elite military officer. And the repercussions of that Christmas night would echo across the Maritimes.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
74 years after the murder, the event still troubled older Haligonians.
The story of this most mysterious case at the time created the very greatest excitement in Halifax, is now being lost in the forgotten past,
wrote 28-year-old up-and-coming Halifax historian Harry Peers. Peers would go on to have an extraordinarily influential career as the keeper of Nova Scotia's history. Only 1 year after publishing his definitive version of what happened that night in a lengthy 2-part series in the New Brunswick magazine, he would found the Nova Scotia Public Archives. He would go on curating this institution until his death at the age of 69 in 1940. He wrote this article because he was troubled that the story was being forgotten. So, the young Harry Peers began contacting the oldest surviving people who still remembered what happened that Christmas night in order to piece together the events before it was too late.
This street that the murder happened on was then usually called Barrack Street, but it was also appropriately nicknamed Knock Me Down Street. Although physically the highest, it was morally the lowest quarter of town, and even in the daytime few cared to risk themselves within its precincts. Robberies and murders and riots, which had from time to time occurred there, caused the place to be shunned by everyone of respectability. Such was the scene of this story at the period of which I write.
It was still dark the morning after Christmas when Edward Harlands from the 74th Regiment woke up in the officers' quarters.
On looking out of the barrack window, he saw indistinctly in the gloom a man lying near the well in front of the building. Suspecting something was wrong, he dressed and on going down found the man lying on his face with his right hand extended to his neck. He ascertained life was extinct.
Evidently not much interested, he left without touching the body. Officer Edward Harlands had noted that the dead man was not an officer, but he was merely a local. So he went back to bed without so much as even examining the man. Shortly afterwards, another soldier, a private named Rogers, walked past the body.
Rogers turned over the body and was shocked to find the poor fellow had been murdered, a deep wound being in the breast immediately before the right shoulder.
The later coroner's report indicated the dead man had been stabbed right through the chest, through the heart, and he would have died within minutes.
The body proved to be that of Edward Shea, an old pensioner.
Edward Shea had come into Halifax from his hometown of Rawdon, Nova Scotia, where he was supposed to be retired, but he still worked part-time as a school teacher to make ends meet. He had come to Halifax so that he would not be alone that Christmas. By dawn, he would be dead, casually murdered in cold blood. Private Rogers noticed that the body was not yet stiff, and the blood under it on the ground had not frozen yet. Despite it being the crack of dawn the day after Christmas, word of the murder spread startlingly fast throughout town, and soon an immense crowd had gathered in the square. Harry Peers interviewed one of the people who had gone to the square for his article.
One man, James Crosskill, made a careful examination of the corpse. On placing the back of his hand on the body, he detected indications of heat. He and others traced small drops of blood on the snow from close to the body to within 3 yards of the south door of the officers' quarters.
At this time, people across what would later become Canada were extremely deferential towards authority. There was very much a sense that the elites were the elites because they were genuinely superior to everyone else. As colonies that would make up Canada, there was this sense that those that came from the mother country, Great Britain, were simply better than us local people. In military, soldiers obviously looked up to officers. Back then, the public and colonial garrison cities like Halifax also looked up to military officers.
The life of an officer of that garrison was rounds of balls, dinners, drives, horse races, rackets, and amateur theatricals.
By contrast to those lives of officers, the lives of ordinary people were simply seen to be worth less. And the events in Halifax that Christmas Day are the perfect example of this. It's not actually clear that there had been any sort of investigation of the murder itself. However, what was instantly investigated very vigorously by the authorities was a swirl of curiously specific rumors that began to spread. Not only that there was an officer responsible for the murder, but these rumors named one officer in particular who was thought to be responsible. The police really got onto this investigation into the source of the rumors, and it quickly led them to Maggie Hall. When the authorities questioned her, Maggie Hall enthusiastically declared that she was in fact the source of the rumors. And furthermore, not only was she the source of the rumors, but she stood by them. Maggie Hall explained that on the morning of what we now call Boxing Day, she had seen the crowd in the square gathered outside of the officers' barracks. She had pushed through to see what the crowd was looking at, and she saw a dead body. And she recognized him from the night before. Then she told the police what she had seen that night. At 2 a.m, Maggie Hall had been leaving the apartment of one officer and had been walking down the corridor of the officer's barracks to another officer's room. Harry Pierce summarized her story based on her testimony at the subsequent trial.
Hearing, however, a noise in the south entry, the girl changed her purpose and went along a passage that led through the center of the garret. On going downstairs, she heard an officer ordering someone out of the doors with the words, "Be off!" She recognized his voice and, thinking the officer was turning away a woman, was desirous to ascertain who it was. Going a little lower, she could see it was a man, not a woman, he had addressed. The officer was standing in the entry with a strange man, whom he was holding by the shoulder with the left hand, while the other hand held a candle. Without releasing the man, Cross put the candle on the stairs, and in doing so, she obtained a full view of him.
He was a wealthy young British officer named Richard Cross.
Creeping downstairs, she peered from the threshold and saw Richard Cross pushing the man before him toward the well. She followed at a distance and then stood under one of the neighboring trees, from whence, straining her eyes in the darkness, she saw him apparently take both hands off the man and then push him to the ground. During all this, the stranger had not struggled or uttered a word, nor had Cross spoken. While the man lay on the ground, his assailant looked at him for a few moments, and then came toward the building, in doing which he passed near the tree where Maggie Hall stood, and seeing her, quickened his pace. She followed, and when he had entered the south hall, she saw him take up the candle and go into his own room, the door of which he locked.
At the time, Maggie Hall didn't give much thought to what she'd seen. Yet, by the time she was speaking to the police, she was well aware of the significance of what she'd seen the night before. The police, for their part, didn't really believe Maggie Hall. They had many reasons for this, none of which were actually based on what she had witnessed. First of all, Maggie Hall was young, at only 19 years old. Second of all, Maggie Hall was a black woman. Third of all, Maggie Hall was a sex worker. Fourth of all, and perhaps most shockingly of all to the police, Maggie Hall wasn't actually ashamed of being a sex worker. She was actually quite proud of her job because it provided her with an independent income and a distinctly above average lifestyle. And if that wasn't enough, worst of all, as far as the police were concerned, Maggie Hall was an American. And this was a time when Nova Scotia had very recently been at war with the United States in the War of 1812, which had been less than a decade earlier. So Maggie Hall said that night she continued on to her appointment in another officer's room. Later that evening, as she was leaving that officer's room, she glanced out the window, and she noticed that the man was still there on the ground. The police didn't do anything with the information they received from Maggie Hall. But then one particular cop leaked the story to the Acadian Reporter newspaper. The newspaper ran the story, including the accused officer's name. The other Nova Scotian media outlets jumped on the story, not to start reporting on what had been witnessed or criticizing the police, but to criticize the Acadian Reporter for daring to print the officer's name. The Acadian Reporter, for its part, fired back a full-throttle defense, writing,
"We never before heard of an instance where any delicacy was felt or made use of to conceal the name of a person in actual custody, whatever his rank might be. And for ourselves, we will say that our pen shall never be prostituted to introduce any novel distinction of person contrary to the ends of justice."
However, the Acadian Reporter newspaper also promptly negated that principled stand for freedom of the press by adding, literally in these big, bold letters,
"We feel very sorry for the situation in which Mr. Cross is placed. We as individuals believe him innocent."
They then went on to explain that they printed the officer's name not to out him, but because the rival papers were hinting it was an officer without naming him, and it was therefore causing all the officers to become suspected. They wrote that they printed his name to comfort the other officers, their family, and their friends to alleviate them of suspicion. So basically, somehow these newspapers were managing to be somehow even more deferential towards these elites. This continuing deference towards the British authorities would apply to the subsequent trial as well. It wasn't a Hollywood type of trial. It was a very polite trial. There was no theatrical fireworks, or honestly, there wasn't really anything even close to exciting. Several witnesses were called to Richard Cross's defense. Yet, all of his fellow officers admitted on the stand that while they were with him before the events of the actual murder, not one of them could actually give him an alibi for the time of night when Maggie Hall had seen him. Interestingly enough, the cross-examination had no negative comments to say about Maggie Hall herself, and she was actually treated nothing short of politely. Perhaps surprisingly, as far as I could find in my research, there were no remarks or actually anything disparaging at all that was noted during the trial about her employment, her race, or even her American citizenship, or her young age. The only thing that was ever mentioned during the trial were some vague comments approving of how it was a classy move on her part that she refused to name any of the officers she visited that night. None of this politeness towards her was applied by the newspapers. They wrote some really ugly and frankly incredibly openly racist things about her, which are way too extreme for me to even pull quotes out of. At the actual trial, the only negative words that were said against Maggie Hall were said by the defendant, Richard Cross. He delivered a very quiet speech that was, as paraphrased by Harry Peers,
He referred to the Hall girl as having voluntarily come forward for the purpose of ruining him, a course that must be prompted by the deadliest and most implacable hostility that could only be accounted for by the fact that on one occasion he rebuked her and threatened her with punishment.
When cross-examined, though, surprisingly enough, Maggie Hall denied that he ever threatened her. In fact, she denied even really knowing Richard Cross, except in passing. She admitted that she didn't really care for Richard Cross, but the truth is, she didn't really care for any of the British officers. She said on the stand that she thought they were too proud, they were too aloof, and that they thought they were so much better than her, or for that matter, anyone else in Halifax. Even despite this, though, she said that she didn't care enough about the officers to bother making up stories about them. This deference that we're talking about towards the elite officers also applied to the defense. They didn't vigorously examine the accused, and the Attorney General in charge of the case did not even give a closing statement. And then, perhaps most importantly, the presiding judge, Justice Halliburton, gave an hour-long speech to the jury in which he, according to Harry Piers, said,
"The only testimony that affected the prisoner in the least was Margaret Hall, and they had heard her contradicted in some particulars. If they did not believe her, there was the end of the charge. But it was also his opinion that even if she was believed, there was nevertheless not sufficient evidence to convict." The judge's speech, which lasted an hour, was through in favor of the prisoner.
The jury retired. And then, less than 2 minutes later, the jury returned with their verdict: not guilty. In a sign of the changing times in the Maritimes, though, in the aftermath of the trial, a sickened, uneasy feeling began to settle over Halifax. The general public began to feel like justice had been denied, and people began to agree in whispered, hushed voices that maybe what Maggie had said on the stand about how proud and how full of themselves these British officers were, about how they looked down on the locals, well, maybe that was true. The general opinion was that the dashing and wealthy young British officer had murdered the old school teacher from Nova Scotia in cold blood on Christmas Day, for no other reason than that he had woken him up by knocking on the door, asking for somewhere to stay the night. The disgust of the Nova Scotians only deepened when the officers held a great party to celebrate Richard Cross's release. Soon afterwards, Richard Cross was promoted, which was seen as a real slap in the face to the local people of Halifax. Soon the officers noticed that ordinary Haligonians suddenly became colder towards them. They were less friendly, they were not so differential. Newspapers began to openly criticize them for their haughty behavior. Fewer visitors came to their parties and their balls. The military itself began to sour on Officer Richard Cross. Despite his term in Halifax having not ended, he was quietly sent away to a news station in the West Indies. Richard Cross was said to have come to a rather abrupt end shortly after his new posting to the West Indies. Shortly after arriving there, he lost his temper at a servant, and, in much the same way he had attacked the old school teacher Edward Shea, he began beating the servant. This time would be different, though. The servant grabbed the baton Richard Cross was beating him with and stabbed him with it, killing him, much like how Richard Cross had killed Edward Shea at that Christmas night in Halifax.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.